Welcome to our Bible study on Romans. We're in week number 34, meaning we're in Romans chapter 11. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 6. As always, this is part of a long series. No part of Romans should ever be taken out of context from the flow of the whole letter. So if this is your first time here, stick around. You'll be able to get something out of it today, but then go back and kind of start at the beginning. Again, we're in the third section of Romans where Paul kind of takes a left turn. It still flows very well within the overall theme of the letter, but he's dealing directly with how Israel now fits in, right? The first two sections kind of dealt with the problem of sin and the solution of Jesus at large and how God worked through Israel. But now that Israel is not the only people that are chosen, but God has expanded the invitation to the whole world, well, how does Israel now fit in? And so we've been kind of dealing with that. Chapter 9 and 10, they dealt with like the story so far, how God worked through Israel and how they rejected him, how they were looking for the Messiah, but yet they've missed him. Like we finished last week with the end of chapter 10, verses 18 through 21, where it says, all of this might make us ask, did Israel not hear? They certainly did. Their sound went out into all the world and their words to the ends of the earth. But I ask, did Israel not know? Well, to begin with, Moses says, and he quotes some verses from Deuteronomy, which every Israelite would know. He said, I will make you jealous with a non-nation and stir you to anger with a foolish people. The prophecy saying, yes, there would be a time when they wouldn't know, that God would invite all these other nations. So he's saying, yes, they did know. And then verse 20 says, then Isaiah, greatly daring, puts it like this. I was found by those who were not looking for me. I became visible to those who were not asking for me. But in respect of Israel, he says, all day long I have stretched out my hands to a disbelieving and disagreeable people. So we finished by looking at the idea that the people who weren't looking for the Messiah, for God, the Gentiles, they found him through Jesus. But those who were searching for it, they missed him. But God is still standing towards them. His stance is still that of open arms, of a hug, right? This is the end of the prodigal son, that Jesus is waiting on them to turn back to, that it's not just the Gentiles he wants, and we're going to deal with that today. And so chapter 11, verses 1 through 6, it starts down this idea of answering a really big question about how Israel fits in. It's a multi-step answer, so we're just going to look at the very beginning of it, kind of skip to the end a little bit so it makes sense. But this end of chapter 11, or the beginning, all of chapter 11, is kind of how Paul answers that question. So today's section is verses 1 through 6, where it says, so I ask, has God abandoned his people, being Israel? Certainly not. I am an Israelite myself, from the seed of Abraham and the tribe of Benjamin. God has not abandoned his people, the ones he chose in advance. Don't you know what the Bible says in the passage about Elijah, describing how he pleads with God against Israel? Lord, Elijah says, they have killed your prophets. They have thrown down your altars. I'm the only one left, and they are trying to kill me. But what is the reply from the divine word? I have left for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. In the same way, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, it is no longer by works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. See, this section, he starts to kind of spell things out. And I think it starts with understanding Elijah's situation in order to understand Paul's situation, because Paul is intentionally paralleling himself with the prophet Elijah. If you're unfamiliar, Elijah's story can be found in the book of 1 Kings in the Old Testament. What he references today comes from chapters 18 and 19. But Elijah was like the superhero movie action star prophet. He did incredible things, called down fire from heaven, like invented trash talking, had animals feed him when he needed, like he did all these incredible things. And the part that of his story that Paul references today was right after Elijah had done probably his most miraculous thing, right? He was in this battle with the prophets of this false god named Baal, which Baal means master. So one of the master gods, right? And so this Canaanite god and his priests, he had the ears of the royalty of Jezebel and Ahab. And so they were persecuting the prophets of Israel. persecuting the prophets of the God Yahweh. And so Elijah challenges Queen Jezebel and her prophets on Mount Carmel, and they go and they both set up altars, and they both sacrifice a bull on it, and then they both say, all right, whoever's God will set the altars on fire. That's the true God. And so the prophets of Baal, they spend hours and hours trying to get their God's attention, and they're cutting themselves and doing acts of sacrifice, trying to get their God to set this altar on fire. And the whole time Elijah invents trash talking by saying maybe he's in the toilet. Like literally, that's what he said. Maybe he's in the bathroom. Maybe he can't hear you. Maybe he's taking a nap. And then Elijah goes and he says, well, I want you to take water and I want you to soak this altar. Like soak it through and through so that there's standing water everywhere. No way that anybody can light this match and get this altar to burn. To which case, they do that, and they praise to God, and God sends down fire, and it burns up even the stones. It's that hot of a fire. It's an incredible moment where God displays himself. Elijah is vindicated, and you'd think this would be the moment when Elijah's like, I'm on top of the world. Nobody can stop me. Look what I just did. But like most people in power, when their power is questioned and challenged, they fight dirty. And so Queen Jezebel put out a warrant on Elijah's life, that they wanted him dead or alive, didn't care, kill that guy. That was what Elijah had to do. And then they continued to kill the prophets like Elijah, the prophets of Israel's God, Yahweh. And so Elijah became depressed, and he had to flee, right? He had to run to the desert. He had to run. And then probably the second most famous part, probably the most preached part of Elijah's story, he had the moment where he was in the mountain and there was an earthquake and a fire and a windstorm, a tornado, and God wasn't in any of those big loud things, but God was in a still small voice. But what I want you to see there is that Elijah's heart was broken, right? After the incident on Mount Carmel, he was depressed. He begged for his life to be ended by God. He was lonely, he was hungry, he was tired. Everything that he had worked for was taken from him. All his victories seemingly meant nothing. All his wins were worthless. He was low and depressed. But then God says, listen, everything you've done, I've done through you. And it wasn't for nothing. Yes, most of Israel has turned its back. Most of the northern tribes have turned their back on me, but I still have a remnant. I still have a group of 7,000 that are still loyal, that haven't worshipped the Baal, the masters. They're still faithful to me. What you've done has not been a waste. See, Paul himself, we know, he struggled with depression. I mean, Paul lived his life on the road where he was hungry and lonely and wondered if what he was doing was mattering, or if anybody was getting reached through his efforts, or if he was just suffering for nothing. I mean, we see in his second letter to the Corinthian church, chapter 1, verses 8 through 9, he says, you see, my dear family, we don't want to keep you in the dark about the suffering we went through in Asia, southwest Turkey. The load we had to carry was far too heavy for us. It got to the point where we gave up on life itself. Yes, deep inside ourselves, we received the death sentence. This was to stop us relying on ourselves, to make us rely on the God who raises the dead. Paul was to the point of giving up, begging for life to end, that he had gotten to the point where he received the death sentence in his heart because of the sacrifices he was making. Paul understands this, right? 2 Corinthians was probably written a little bit after Romans, or either right before. Either way, it's very close to when Paul wrote Romans. And we see in Romans that Paul had sorrow, right? Chapter 9, verses 1 through 3, he talks about how he's overcome with grief and sorrow for his people because they have rejected the Messiah that they've been waiting on. That in chapter 10, verse 1, he says he would sacrifice his own salvation if Israel would accept Jesus, Messiah, how he is the fulfillment of everything they've been looking for. See, it would be easy for him in this moment to sink back into depression. But he allows the gospel to inform his thinking, to reshape his thinking. And when you change your thinking, it changes your emotions, because your emotions, for the most part, come from your thinking. See, sometimes when you get to rock bottom, there's a thing that can happen. You can have a moment of clarity where you can finally and fully see the truth. You can see things for what they are. And I'm not saying that Paul needed to hit rock bottom to see the truth. He had accepted the truth a long time ago, but Paul had to grow. We saw that in instances like where him and Barnabas had to split ways because of a dispute over John Mark. That's something that they later on would reconcile over, but in the moment they were both too hot-headed to come to terms and agree over it. See, Paul had to grow too, even though he was an apostle and this prolific deliverer of messages from God, meaning he wrote a lot of the New Testament. Even he needed to grow. Rock bottom moments, valley moments, aren't necessarily a bad thing. See, Paul has really only made the case thus far that despite God working through Israel, Israel still turns her back on Jesus wholesale. Like, right? If you read chapters 9 and 10, that's basically all he's done. He says, like, over and over, like, this is how God worked through them. This is the amazing things he did. Even when they messed up, God worked through those mistakes. And Jesus makes the offer, but they still turn their back on him. Which gets us to the point where we have to ask this question, is God done with Israel? And we've talked about this a little bit thus far, but here, this is where it really comes to a head. And we can't haphazardly ignore this question. Has God rejected Israel? Because it leads to a very ugly thing. Anti-Semitism has very deep roots in Western culture. Centuries, not just the Nazis, centuries before that. Read about what happened to the Jewish communities in Spain and Western Europe and Eastern Europe. Like, there's been a lot of anti-Semitism, and almost all of it has its roots in getting the answer to this question wrong. They use the Bible as a shiv and not as a healer, right? They use it to cut and slice and attack the Jewish community instead of recognize them for who they are and what they are. See, Romans 11 is a step-by-step answer to that question. Is God done with Israel? And step one, and what we're going to look at today, is that God has left a remnant. No, like all of Israel has not rejected God. There is a remnant. But the remnant, that's a very biblical concept, at least the way we're using it here, the way Paul uses it. We're not talking just about, how you would Webster's define a remnant. A biblical remnant is a community that has survived some form of crisis or catastrophe. Those who can carry on, those who are left behind. Isaiah promised a remnant would return after the exiles. Right? After the Assyrians and then the Babylonians carried off the best and the brightest, after conquering, destroying Jerusalem and the northern territories, he promised there would be an exile that would return. Most never would, but a small remnant did. Moses promised a remnant would be transformed, that they would have circumcision of the heart, that God would seek them out and do a new thing in them, that the wisdom of God would be within them, found within them. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, most would turn away, but a few would be transformed. See, in Paul's day, many Jewish groups thought they were that remnant that was talked about in their Bibles, in the Torah and in the prophets. Most of them thought they were the remnant left behind, the ones who truly remained faithful. I mean, that's why keeping the law XYZ way was so important. And you had all these different groups, the Essenes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they all believed that them keeping the law the right way made them the true Israel, the remnant that the prophets talked about. See, Paul's remnant that he talks about here are who's left after the greatest crisis Israel ever faces: the work, the death, the resurrection of their Messiah. Most reject him, but a few would accept him. See, Paul uses himself as an example of the remnant. And he does it by citing specifically 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 22. He starts off by saying, hey, I am a Benjaminite. If you're unfamiliar, that the southern tribes, the two that remained together, were Judah and Benjamin. So the Assyrians conquered and hauled off the northern tribes, and most of them never returned. They became Samaria, basically. But in the south, Benjamin and Judah carried on for a little bit longer until the Babylonians finally destroyed them, but they returned, and the tribes of Benjamin and Judah carried on. They were a remnant, right? So he specifically mentions this to draw your attention to it. And then he quotes 1 Samuel 12:22. He says, "For the Lord will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it has pleased the Lord to make you a people for himself." God will not completely abandon his people, basically. And this passage comes from when the people were wanting a king. They were demanding a king. And in order to show God's faithfulness to the people in the covenant, he gave them a king. And if you're familiar with your Bible history, you know that the first king that was chosen was a guy named Saul. Paul's other name, his Jewish name, was Saul. In Greek, that sounds like little guy. So he went by Paul when he went to minister to the Greeks, right? He didn't change his name. That was just the two names he went by. But it's no accident that Paul is citing this, because Saul is his own namesake. And Saul was also a Benjaminite. Paul is using himself as evidence that the remnant is there. As God has always done, he has left behind a remnant. But this remnant is different, because the remnant in the Old Testament, those people carried on as they'd always carried on, right? Verse 5 and 6 of today's section, it says, in the same way, at the present time, there is a remnant. But he says that remnant, though, is chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, it is no longer by works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. This new remnant is not just people who have continued to work hard, who've continued to remain faithful. Yes, they have the same faith that they did before. Yes, they're worshiping the same God, but it has been transformed and remade and reshaped by God's Son, Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah. The remnant in Israel exists not because they deserve to exist or they've worked hard enough to exist, but because of the love of Christ and his faithfulness. Jesus revealed the truth. And that truth is that no one is righteous on their own accord. No one is able to be made right. That's what Paul talked about a lot in the first section of Romans, of this letter. But if you look at this first step, that there is a remnant, that God has not completely abandoned Israel, like step one, part one, is there's a remnant, right? People within Israel who are accepting of Jesus the Messiah. If you take that and you compare it to where this whole argument ends in verse 32, you'll see that it starts to connect. See, verse 32 says, for God has shut up all people in disobedience so that he may have mercy upon all, right? That God's mercy is extended to all, including Israel. That despite universal sin, God found a way to rescue his people, just like what he did with Elijah, but only on a much grander scale. See, Paul has hope. And hope is the last thing to die, right? If you're the remnant, you're still standing. You're the last ones. And the last ones to truly die, the last thing to truly die is hope. Because once hope dies, there's nothing left. And what Paul is saying is that in Christ we have a hope that can't die. As long as you are faithful to him, he is faithful to you. It can't be taken away. And so in the same way, we have hope when our problems in our life, when the issues that we face, when the things that we struggle with, the mountains that we climb are not only seem like they're too big to handle, but are too big to handle. We have the hope of Christ who overcomes all, because we are in his hand and nothing can take us from it. He is the one who makes all things possible, that we are more than conquerors, more than victorious, that we are more than able to survive whatever we face because of Christ. There will be scars a lot of times, and a lot of times we may not physically survive it, but in the way that matters, in the way that lasts into eternity, nothing can touch us. Hopefully this helps you understand and start to work through answering the question of, is God done with Israel, a little bit better? If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.